Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to see you all, and thank you so much for this lovely introduction. I would like to present our working group that focused on the condition for alternative knowledge creation. The idea for this webinar series originated from a conversation Sue and I had. We agreed that the conditions under which we conduct research have not attracted the attention they deserve. When it comes to the format for our working group, we opted for a more traditional format, not at least given the short period of time we had. We started in September, but we hadn't had much time to prepare, to get going till the conference of today. We invited different scholars, experts in the field that we considered vital to initiate the conversation on the conditions we need for our own knowledge, for alternative knowledge creation. Many of the scholars have been part of the unique project as well. We managed to create a really nice platform with a broad range of participants, many of them PhD students, and some coming from outside of Europe. What we didn't do, we didn't kind of focus on academic freedom as such. So what I would like to do today is to share some of the insights of this webinar, of our working group, and then reflect on the implications for academic freedom. Our webinar essentially focused on three areas: the marketization of higher education, the market concentration in the academic publishing, and last but not least, the digitalization of higher education. For each of the three dimensions, we explored key challenges, but also discussed possible strategies to overcome and to address them. In this sense, our webinar was on one side problem focused, but as well as forward-looking. So we didn't, as I said, focus on academic freedom. So this is what I'm going to do. I would like to draw your attention by doing so on new challenges that we need to address in our own reflection on academic freedom. And I hope to prepare the ground for with this presentation for the country reports that come later this morning. So let me move to the first dimension we addressed in our webinar. A key issue we discussed was the financialization, the marketization of higher education. This process can be observed in particular in the Anglophone world, where higher education is no longer seen as a public infrastructure, but rather as a market. Public funding continues to play a role. However, as we have seen yesterday, the share has become significantly reduced. Tuition fees has become an important stream of income, particularly for English higher education institutions. I will keep this point rather short, since Chris Shaw will come back to it in his analysis of academic freedom in the UK. In our webinar, Chris Newfield highlighted that it's not only about the funding, but it's also about the discursive framing of what universities are for. The purpose of universities are increasingly defined in pecuniary terms. Everything needs to be justified in terms of value for money. In this context, government and the students are increasingly regarded as customers. The money for value paradigm portrays the government as the main customer of the service that universities provide. This framing helps the government to tighten its grips on universities. The customer is king, as we know. This has very worrying consequences for the academic freedom as well. And I would go so far for the quality of the research as such. Why? Let me explain what I mean. Academic freedom, defined as freedom of research and institutional autonomy, is not just a value in itself. It also has an important function. It is the precondition of the creation of an ever more specialized and diversified knowledge. My argument draws here on Robert Merton and his sociology of science that he developed in the late 1930s, early 1940s. Merton argues here that the highly specialized nature of science makes it impossible for a non-specialist to assess its quality. And this even applies to the academic communities as such. I'm a sociologist. What do I know about nanotechnology? How can I assess the quality of someone doing research in this area? This situation requires that the scientific community develops a scientific ethos, a normative structure, as Merton puts it. A key part of this ethos is the orientation of the scientific communities and culture towards communism, as Merton calls it. With communism, he means a non-technical and extended sense of common ownership of goods. It's a clear commitment of science and academic communities to serve society. Any finding of research belongs to society and needs to help it to develop further. A second integral element of the scientific ethos is the organized skepticism. It is a skepticism that takes nothing for granted and incessantly scrutinizes the work of fellow scientists to identify flaws and errors in their work. It is the peer review only that can assure the quality of scientific research. Hence, here we get a sense of the importance of academic community for ensuring the quality of research. Drawing on Merton, I argue that the tightening of the control over universities risk undermining scientific communities, and as a consequence, its organized skepticism. Merton's sociology of science brings, in addition, a worrying historical parallel to the fore. He developed his sociology of science while the Nazi regime was in power and addressed on several occasions in his writing how the government tried to crack down on the scientific communities, undermine their scientific ethos, in particular their organized skepticism. Here I quote, "In modern totalitarian society, anti-rationalism and the centralization of institutional control both serve to limit the scope provided for scientific activity," and the organized skepticism we should add here. In difference to the authoritarian structure back then, particularly in the Anglophone world, the government made use of the market to increase their control. I refer to this increase of state control as neoliberal authoritarianism, and we will see later on with the case studies drawing on Poland and Hungary, there are different types of authoritarianism that we need to account for that risk undermining academic freedom. And the attack on science and its institutional autonomy also makes us reflect on the social structure we need. And here, again, there is an interesting parallel to the situation back then that Merton describes, where he concludes the actual attacks, I quote, "the actual attacks upon the integrity of science have led scientists to recognize their dependence on particular types of social structures." It seems that we are in a similar situation today again. The many attacks on higher education institutions that we have heard about before invites us actually to reflect on the universities we want to have in the future. But not only governments, the students as well have become framed as customers, particularly in countries with significant tuition fees. Chris Shaw will come back to this point. I just would like to highlight one important point that had been discussed in our webinar. Chris Newfield highlighted in his presentation that the reference to students as clients is often linked to the human capital paradigm. Students are encouraged to see their tuition fees investment into their future. The problem of this framing is that it essentially reduces universities to labor market institutions. This focus on employability eclipses all the other key roles universities play in society. Chris made a convincing argument in his presentation that it is now the right moment to challenge this reduction, because the reality of an increasing number of graduates contradicts the promises of the human capital paradigm. A recent study of the Institute for Fiscal Studies shows that 1 in 5 students in the UK would actually have been better off financially had they not gone to university. Gender and the study subject play a vital role in this context. Creative arts and languages have 0 or even negative returns. We can expect the pandemic to have worsened the situation for arts and languages further. This crisis is the right moment to remind society and the politicians of the many roles universities play. It's not just the non-economic benefits for the individual and society. Chris outlined in his presentation a number of other non-economic benefits. They're all public, social, collective, and non-economic in their orientation. One of the many purposes of universities is community building. These communities are not limited to academic communities, as Martin O'Neill in our webinar series highlighted. Martin outlined in his presentation interesting examples where universities played a key role in creating local communities and helping them to develop their regions. Building the wealth of communities involves a plurality of strategies, all directed at the same broad goal of leveraging existing institutional power to create more egalitarian and more democratic local communities. He referred in his presentation explicitly to the Democracy Collaborative, an initiative originating from the US. And here you see some of the key principles. As here on the side, you also see the link where you can find these basic principles. The Montague University would be another interesting example, and Sue, I'm sure, could elaborate on that in the Q&A later on. Another important example would be the Preston project, where the Preston University took a key role in developing the region in the UK. Again, Sue could elaborate on that because she also has published a chapter in this book. So how could we use the idea of community wealth building to develop further our notion of academic freedom? Maybe we should radicalize Merton's idea of communism and highlight the key role universities can play to empower also non-academic communities. So let me move on to the second challenge that I identified, which is the concentration in the publishing sector. David Miller presented in one of our sessions his analysis of a very worrying development. The number of publishers continues falling, while a few publishers have managed to become big players. And here you can see on the graph how the number of other publishers have dropped in recent years. And here you can see on the graph some of the big players that have really gained from that shift, from that concentration of the market. And we all know about the outrageous business model of academic publishing, where academics, paid by taxpayers, write articles, review articles that then are bought by the tax-funded university libraries. Particularly big publishers have benefited from this business model, as this number here shows. And this is not just about plundering public resources. The hiding of publicly funded research behind paywalls is against Merton's principle of communism, according to which all results should be publicly available. In addition, the concentration of the market gives the big publisher an increasing leverage over the academic knowledge dissemination, and essentially also on the validation of what counts as good academic knowledge. We all know how the H-index has become a proxy for academic quality. However, the H-index is not neutral. It is rather influenced by the ownership in academic publishing. So how can our notion of academic freedom account for this development? What type of academic publishing would we need that supports academic freedom? We had the fantastic opportunity to learn from Vivian Birken from Birken Books, an independent publisher of scholarly books and journals in the field of humanities and social science, how we could create an alternative form of publishing that ensures open access and diversity. So very different from the current mainstream open access that essentially supports the concentration in the publishing sector. So she has developed a different model that ensures diversity. I can't go into further detail about her model due to time constraints, but I highly recommend listening to her presentation It's on the website of Jeff, I think. What she highlighted in her presentation is the role scholarly communities, but also the community of librarians play in order to ensure an open access model. So again, communities play a vital role in ensuring the diversity of publishing and hence knowledge dissemination. So let us move to the third and last dimension, the digitalization. We could refer to the digitalization of higher education as a silent revolution, accelerated for sure by the pandemic. Digital products, services, and platforms have become pivotal for supporting teaching and learning, research, governing universities, and outreaching to students. We have discussed the importance of digitalization at our conference already. What we see here, just to support my argument about the importance of the development, here you see the results of an open consultation carried out by the International Association of Universities, actually pre-pandemic in 2018 and 19, where over 100 countries have replied to, and it shows the majority of them have already a national strategy in place, and many departments and faculty have taken initiatives in order to transform their teaching and to increase the digitalization there. Many of the digital services and products and platforms are provided by for-profit providers. In many cases, closely linked to venture capital, as Janja Komeljenovic showed in her contribution to our webinar. We could speak of a Netflix moment for the educational sector, challenging the existing forms of teaching. We could also understand the digitalization as a privatization through the back door, but it is actually more than that, as Janja showed in her presentation. It comes with a new business model and assetization. It is the access to data that gets sold, not the data as such. Property and control rights stay with the owner. The users can't buy the data. They just pay rents for using them, even though they might actually have contributed to the creation of the data in the first instance. Drawing on the brilliant work of Zuzana Zuboff, we can go a step further to better understand the implication for academic freedom. Zuboff argues that artificial intelligence profoundly changes our way of learning. Artificial intelligence allows us to learn, while it excludes us at the same time from owning our own learning. Let's think of the example of the driverless car. Artificial intelligence makes it possible to drive extremely safely. I think we all agree on that. However, we won't learn from it. We can never become an experienced driver. We remain ignorant and depend on the algorithm and its way of processing information. At the same time, we don't know why we do what we do, given that the operation of the algorithm is protected as a business secret. This shift of learning might have major implications for academia and its role of helping society in learning from past experience. It might even render parts of academia obsolete, shifting the place where knowledge based on experience is created. This place might no longer be public, but owned by for-profit companies. I refer to these companies in my publication as a transnational private authority. This private authority has an important geopolitical dimension that we have not yet touched upon at our conference. I highlighted in my contribution to the webinar that the authority is actually not transnational. The big tech companies have their headquarters in the US and Asia, mainly China. But what are the implications of this shift in power to giant firms for our notion of academic freedom? How can we regain control? A first step forward would be data protection and privacy, but it also would require an understanding of artificial intelligence, making transparent the decisions they make and scrutinize the underpinning assumption they make. Tore Hoel, another speaker at our webinar, made a strong case in favor of such a move, where he talks about the explicability that increasing the transparency, that we start to understand what artificial intelligence is about and the decision they make. However, the discussion at our webinar clearly indicated that this could be only a first step, making the primitive accumulation of data less profitable and hence less interesting to the private companies. So academic freedom needs to be linked to data protection and the transparency and accountability of artificial intelligence. But we need to develop it further, the academic freedom, to address the shifting knowledge curation that the digitalization has introduced. So let me finish on this note. So I hope I have given you some ideas of the key new challenges that higher education is confronted with and that we need to address in our understanding of academic freedom. We might need a new terminology that accounts for the impact of marketization on academic freedom, that accounts for the centralization of academic publishing on academic freedom, and that is capable to address also the fundamental change of higher education, the research and our teaching as well, through the digitalization. I thank you for your attention.
Now the next phase in this session is to say, well, what are the issues at stake in different countries in Europe in our network? And we have 4 papers of 10 minutes each, dashing through them, which I think are just going to show not only Eva's approach to the problems of academic freedom, but a whole range of other ways that people are experiencing problems of academic freedom. So the first one is with Amelia in Portugal, and then we've got Jakob, who's here, and then Chris, who's also online, and then me. After we've set out what we think are the issues at stake, the third phase of the session today will be moving to Astrid in Stockholm, who's Vice President of the Magna Charta Observatory, who will be suggesting some ways forward. So this is our normal procedure. What are the issues at stake? How do we look forward? Are we okay technically? Good.
Yes,
so over to Amelia. You have 10 minutes.
Okay, thank you, Sue. Thank you, Eva, for your presentation and for setting the stage for this very interesting topic and to give me the opportunity to say something about how academic freedom is evolving in the Portuguese context. Well, my presentation, I'm not sharing the screen. The screen is there. I don't know how to move the presentation.
I'll be shifting the slides, so just tell me.
Okay. Otherwise, okay. So my presentation is focusing in 3 issues. On the one hand, I'm bringing here the metaphor of Silent Spring to try to understand what is at stake in the Portuguese context, and this comes also from a previous discussion with Sue and other members of a working group that we were trying to establish within this big project of European universities and critical futures. And this idea, this metaphor of Silent Spring came out from those discussions. And what I'm trying to bring in is the value of the concept to understand the governance reforms in the Portuguese context and the impact it has on academic freedom. You can go, Mathieu. So first of all, I'm going to just briefly address or taking into consideration what Eva just mentioned about the conditions that are impinging on academic work and academic freedom, and are actually changing higher education values. And matter. And this idea of academic freedom and its articulation with the Silent Spring metaphor explicitly brings in this idea that there are changes that are not visible, and what is more than the changes is the lack of awareness of the ways academic freedom are being nibbled away, and and this metaphor show the quiet way that agricultural practices, as Rachel Carson is bringing in, had changed and devastated the countryside until suddenly there are no birds singing in the spring anymore. And these birds are the academics, are education institutions in our context. You can move, Mate. So, in the Portuguese context, the meaning of academic freedom, it's not fixed. And if we look how this concept evolved in articulation with institutional autonomy, we have this strong idea that institutional autonomy and institutional self-regulation is the way to guarantee and protect the freedom to research and the freedom to teach. In terms of the changes in the supervision models by the state, we have had the consolidation of the evaluative state. This means that evaluation and instruments and proceduralism, as Gainev puts it, is conditioning the way higher education institutions behave and act. And this comes together with regulation market mechanisms. Governance reforms since 2007 have been highly influenced by new public management and neoliberal perspectives. And in our research in the Portuguese context, we identify this trend towards boardism, as we call it, as it combines the decrease of the power of academics with the increase of the power of administrative and management staff and the presence of external stakeholders. And more recently, the rise of digital governance is shifting the performance-based management system to a database management system, as Eva just mentioned regarding the use and the question about data-based management. You can move, Mate. Well, and all these has implications, and these are some aspects where governance and management reforms are silently undermining academic freedom. And these are some examples. There are organizational arrangements within higher education institutions to establish external contracts due to the subfinancing or education research by public funds, the national rules to evaluate research that are very externally driven, the national and institutional evaluation and accreditation of degree programs, the institutional regulations for academic performance, the need to demonstrate the social relevance of research and teaching, and the changing publication patterns to counting rankings as is a reflection of a sign of what this issue of open publication and so on has been impinging on. You can move, Matti, please. The question is, what is the meaning then of academic freedom in this context? And it goes well beyond the Humboldtian idea of education through research. And the question is, if this academic freedom is a legal individual academic right or a duty for the whole collective endeavor of higher education institutions. At the European level, European institutions are, and the European Parliament, very recently also in a webinar that was promoted by the European Parliament, and trying to gather academics and politicians on the same platform, are trying to build the European Parliament to look at the treaties and to build the legal basis to protect academic freedom. But the question is how academic freedom is evolving within the dynamics of democracies, and how to protect the academic freedom of expression and the freedom to engage in political and social movements, assuming academics also as citizens. And this is something that in the Portuguese context is also appearing very, very notably. You can move. So I will argue then that academic freedom and its definition is probably in this tension of a legal individual right, but also a duty for the whole collective endeavor of higher education institutions. And why? Because, and I'm bringing here a quote from a colleague, an academic, that I interviewed for the pandemic study, the one that we have been discussing yesterday, and he emphasizes these internal conditions, because we were discussing the external conditions that condition research and teaching and so on, but internally is putting this emphasis on the way the bureaucratization, the administrative burden on academics is taking away our freedom of the mind to debate for the sake of debate. And this brings in, or this institutional aspect brings in this question: what are the consequences of a silently undermining academic freedom? And the question is, who coordinates, leads the learning process of higher education institutions based on collaborative knowledge and revisibility? And this brings in this example Eva just mentioned about artificial intelligence, about data performance management. Who is coordinating and leading this learning process? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Perfect timing. Thank you very much, Emilia. And now we move on to Jakob, and you're going to talk about what's happening in Poland. And would you like that thing?
So can I have a, okay, hello everyone. My name is Jakub. You already will hear me talk on Monday, so without any introduction, I will just mention quickly that this talk is based on a work that we conducted together with my colleague Christian, who you also remember probably for our Monday's meeting and our Monday panel. So without further ado, I would like to use my 10 minutes to convey two messages, 2 points, 2 interconnected points. First of all, I would like to give you a brief outline of what actually is going on in Poland in terms of academic freedom, because we are in the midst of quite heated debate around the problem, which is quite interesting in terms of how different it is to the concerns that you mentioned already in your presentation, highlighting the market forces as something that have to be challenged and something that poses the direct threat to academic freedom. We also may have this problem, but our concerns are a bit of a different nature, as you will see. But also, I would like to point what we can theoretically gain through engaging with the Polish case. Together with Christian, we are philosophers. We like to think of ourselves as kind of dialectical philosophers, so we are always asking those empirical cases, okay, what conceptually we can innovate through engaging with them. So this is sort of things I would like to draw your attention to. All right, so what actually happened in Poland? If you take a look at this table, this is this famous Terence Curran study. Curran is, of course, a long-time researcher of academic freedom. He's doing a comparative research on academic freedom in Europe. And from almost 20 years, he's preparing those sort of rankings, trying to show us, sorry, which, can I just use a laser? Okay, so if you take a look, Poland is here in the middle of the table. This is a quite recent study for 2017, so just from 4 years ago, and you already can see that Poland is in the middle. It's a comfortable position, right? Just between Romania and Finland. Actually, if you would probably, if Karan would make this this study a year ago, probably Poland would even go higher, because in 2008 we introduced a major reform of higher education, and actually you can see that in the first row there are points from academic freedom in legislation, and in 2018 academic freedom was put at the beginning of the new law as a sort of overriding principle for the whole change. So we will probably actually go up if we study the academic freedom in terms of in which Curran proposes to do so. But what's the problem? The new minister appears in 2020, and he tried to define a problem. And the problem is that Polish science is not experiencing enough freedom. So what he wants to do, he wants to convince the academic community that he will actually strengthen the academic freedom. He will give more academic freedom to Polish researchers. Sounds great. But our researchers, Polish researchers, are very skeptical about this idea. So I will try to show you why they are skeptical. And many representative bodies also produce some analysis saying that we shouldn't go that route, that this is a wrong way to go. But actually, despite all this criticism, the changes to the law on higher education are introduced, they are enacted, and they are now in force since November of this year. So what are the nature of the changes that our minister proposed? Well, how he actually would like to strengthen our academic freedom. Well, I would like to draw your attention to the first point, which is the most important one. So Minister Czarnek believes that we can strengthen the academic freedom by releasing academic teachers from disciplinary liability for expressing religious and philosophical beliefs during their classes. This is just a small comment, but I think this is important to understand what's going on. There was a famous case in Poland a few years ago. During sociology classes, a Polish professor introduced her ideas about human sexuality. Those ideas would be probably deemed as xenophobic, unscientific, and so on and so on. Students were unsatisfied that those kind of messages are conveyed during lectures, and the lecturer is using beliefs which are not grounded in the scientific knowledge. So they announced her to the disciplinary board, and she was, in the end, expelled from her job. So this is a kind of context why actually, this sort of proposition is at the agenda. And you actually can see a quote from our minister, who, when he finally triumphed and pushed his changes, he famously commented in the TV that we cannot be held responsible for our worldview, the freedom of which is guaranteed by the Constitution, and this was not the case, as for example in this case of this sociology professor. Those who were possibly afraid to express their views kept quiet so as not to be ostracized. So we already have this idea that there was part of Polish academia that couldn't, speak freely, that they were ostracized. Those are probably the right-wing scientists, as you can probably imagine. That is how it was in this left-wing totalitarianism. So there's already the idea that Polish universities are dominated by sort of left-wing communists. And this is quite important to have a bit of a context and maybe contrast, because at the same time he's saying this, we experience as a society something completely different. That is, we experience one of the largest social movements we have seen since Solidarność, that is social movement for women's reproductive rights. Because the same government from which Czarnek represents wanted to force Polish women to deliver damaged fetus, even in cases when their life is threatened. So Polish women and also Polish men who supported their case went on the streets and make their case to drop this draconian law. So just to have a little contrast of what actually both sides think is totalitarianism. And of course, Czarnek made a very strong position about those sorts of movements. He many times commented that our modern civilization is destructive to our society in terms that it promotes this idea that women should have a successful career, and then of course they end up bearing children in their late 30s, and this is not how it's supposed to be, because if you have a child in your 30s, then you will have only one child. But what we actually would like to is to have more Polish, probably Catholics. So this is a kind of debate that we were in. And of course you can say, all right, this is a clear misunderstanding, right? That what actually Czarnek is proposing is not academic freedom. He is referring to the freedom of speech, and the two things shouldn't be mixed together. Okay, you can say it, but still, do we really can get out of this debate by just drawing the line between academic freedom and the freedom of speech, which is clearly mixed in what Czarnek has proposed? Together with Christian, we argue that this is not such a simple case. Why? Well, I won't go into details because I'm short on time, but I'm a post-structuralist philosopher. When someone is giving me a binary opposition, I'm always saying, okay, there is some middle ground here. And when we think about what is internal to the academic community, what is external, it gets pretty muddy. Like, just take contemporary social studies of science, Sheila Yazanov's idea of co-production between society and science. Do we really can draw a line when we use authority of science and when we just sort of draw on our worldviews? This is not simply the case. So what we advocated for by engaging with this this case is to move away from sort of universal approach to academic freedom. That we shouldn't argue that academic freedom is a kind of normative universal concept. We should de-universalize it. Why? Because once we do that, we can see that what actually happens is that particular ideas about academic freedom are legitimized through narratives about the higher education as a common good. So how higher education, is of use to other, for society at wide. And for us, this has two strong points. First of all, it allows us to draw other social forces to our cause. We do not reproduce this idea of internality and externality, like in terms of scientific community as isolated from what lies beyond it, right? So we can start a dialogue, we can start to produce engaging narrative to draw other social actors to help us, build a case for our academic freedom. And second, I think that this might be quite productive in terms of understanding cultural specificity of higher education and academic freedom in particular. So through engaging with academic freedom as a kind of relational approach, we can create much more richer notion of academic freedom that is supported from those evidence from different systems. So those two kind of points I would like to highlight at the end. And I know I don't have any more time, so I would like to thank you very much for this opportunity to convey this message. This is also our paper, so if you like to expand on what I already said, you can always go and read it. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Jakub. Another detailed approach to what's going on in a different country with a philosophical approach to try and analyze it as well. Now we move to Chris, who I think is in Sweden.
Yeah.
But it's going to be talking about the UK. So over to you, Chris. Chris Shaw.
Thank you, Sue, and thank you for inviting me. Martin, are you okay to control the slides? Yeah.
Yes, I'll do that.
Brilliant, thanks. Well, yeah, could you move on? I'll just say next then. Yeah, thank you. So, I mean, some of what I'm going to say is going to be familiar with you, but I wanted to, my opening gambit, I had 2 points I wanted to make. One was really just echoing Olga Nowotny, Helga Nowotny, who made a very impassioned plea in defense of the social sciences and the humanities against the increasingly utilitarian approach adopted by so many governments in this push towards commercialization, in which she makes the argument that, look, we need our humanities and social sciences because they are the backbone of democracy. I wanted to make the same point that I feel very much the same about academic freedom. We lose it at our peril for democratic societies. But my second kind of more general point and problem is that, yeah, I'm going to talk about academic freedom in the UK, but I also want to expand it to other Anglophone countries with which I'm quite familiar. Now, over the last few years, I've had a number of conversations with colleagues about what it's like to be a university lecturer. And yes, people complain about the usual constraints on them. But one thing that has come out of these conversations is that there is a pervasive low-level anxiety that's manifest around teaching and lecturing, about getting it wrong. As one of my colleagues said, I've never lived in a time or taught in a time where lecturers were more afraid of their students, afraid of getting it wrong. It feels like we're walking on eggshells all the time. And that is a kind of problem I want to talk about. Martin, next slide, please. Because in a way, I mean, I hate to mix metaphors. Maria's metaphor was that academic freedom is being eroded like a silent spring. My metaphor is that in the UK, at least, it's more of a kind of perfect storm, because we're seeing an assault on academic freedom coming from multiple directions. The first and obvious one, of course, is all the 30 years of neoliberal reforms, the progressive marketization and commercialization of higher education, the influx of managerialism, academic capitalism. It spawned a whole lot of other effects. Then, of course, we have austerity since 2010. I mean, it's only the post-pandemic or pandemic reaction that has ended that. But we still got that in higher education in the UK. This continuous search for efficiency savings and attempt to enhance quality. And then, of course, the absolutely suffocating effects of the audit culture and its anxiety-inducing performance indicators, targets, research, assessment exercises, rankings, and so on. Next slide, please. But there is another threat, and it's an awkward one because we don't often talk about it. And this is the threat to academic freedom that actually is coming from within the university itself, often from within students, angry students, and some lecturers. And it's often framed around identity politics, particularly sensitive issues. And it's manifest in sort of the no platforming of speakers, social media campaigns, often quite vicious, aimed at denigrating or silencing people whose views a particular group disagrees with. It's the kind of the online social media version of what used to be called slut shaming in villages and so on. And because the issue, well, actually, no, the key question I want to ask is, how are these phenomena related? Does this relate to the commercialization of higher education? I think it does, but I'll try and point out how. Now, because the issue is so often weaponized by the right, i.e. attacks on political correctness, etc., the left doesn't seem to take it very seriously. It's sort of met with, and I quote, eye-rolling indignation as opposed to reflexive self-criticism. And this denial, refusal to actually accept that there is a problem here, allows vice-chancellors and even government ministers like this man here, Gavin Williamson, to champion the cause of academic freedom. And earlier in 2001, in February, the former Minister of Higher Education, Gavin Williams, gave this kind of speech, passionate defense of academic freedom, which he clearly is not, in practice, somebody who you would attribute that mantle to, but introducing legislation to make it obligatory and to legislate firmer measures to ensure that academic freedom is manifest on campus. So using the law, again, student unions complained about it. It was a blunt instrument and the wrong kind of approach. Next slide, please, Martin. But I have a case study, and this is one that came to light. This is just a month ago, and it's highly indicative. The case of Sussex University Professor of Philosophy, Kathleen Stock. Kathleen Stock is the author of a book. She's a feminist, lesbian feminist, philosopher, wrote a book earlier this year called Material Girls, Why Reality Matters, in which she takes on what she calls the ideology of gender identity and argues that just because you may feel that you are not in the right body, it doesn't change some of the fundamentals of biological sex, which I don't even want to take a stance on that viewpoint. But because of that standpoint and the fact that she gave evidence to a House of Commons inquiry, she was vilified and attacked as a transphobe and was accused by students at Sussex University of making them feel unsafe. And a big protest erupted a few weeks ago, and the student activists demanded that the university should sack her immediately. The campaign, she did eventually resign 2 weeks ago, and has given lots of media reports, including on Women's Hour, in which she describes it as being, her ordeal was like a medieval witch hunt. It was surreal. But eventually, what's at stake here? The debate wasn't about whether Kathleen Stock as a philosopher was right or wrong. It was really about whether she should be allowed to express her views. And clearly some people on campus, and you can see the process here, thought that shouldn't be the case. And it was there's a sort of an ugliness to the demonstrations, but I'm sure the demonstrators will think, well, this is entirely legitimate. Next slide, please. Now, the student union, when pressed on this, the National Union of Students said, look, there is no evidence of a freedom of expression campus on crisis, and that what you're seeing here is just one-off or occasional isolated incidences, but there are quite a few of them and quite a few quite well-known people, even more so in the United States. Tom Slater did an edited book a few years ago called Unsafe Space, The Crisis of Free Speech on Campus, which he kind of points out that the erosion of free speech has very much arisen from a kind of managerial redefinition of student safety, not in terms of physical harm, but in terms of emotional harm and discomfort, so that harm has now become conflated with discomfort. And another writer in the Financial Times, a long essayist, says, this resignation of Kathleen Stock is symptomatic of a culture that prioritizes the emotional safety of students over robust debate and the expression of lawful evidence-based opinions. I mean, if I could be a bit provocative and quote another, you know, like I see this as sort of, it's kind of like evidence of the emotional construction of reality. Not I think, therefore I am, but I feel it to be true, therefore it is. And paradoxically, this is kind of very much akin to the kind of the Trumpian truthiness, the post-truth idea that, you know, if you feel something strong enough, then of course it's true. And you have to be respected in that belief that science and external reality don't matter in comparison to your emotive, subjective feeling. Next slide, please. Now, as I say, academics are often quite good at standing up to government bullying. They can protest, but we're not so good when the harassment comes from students or is, you know, waged in the name of social justice, because our whole professional ethos is geared to, you know, being there for our students. But I think, again, and this is probably a point that Ava has already made, and Chris Newfield, that 30 years of neoliberal reforms and the student loans, competition, financialization, the creation of new offices for students and so on, have reshaped the fabric of the relationship between academics, students, and the institution. Yes, it has recast higher education as a commodity. Yep, students have been reframed as consumers, and we know that in consumer law, the consumer is always right. And of course, we've got this fetish about the student experience, which has to be created, monitored, measured through satisfaction surveys and other metrics. So there's a question though, you know, is intolerance in anxiety kind of built into the logic of this student as consumer narrative? Next slide, please. So some people have argued that in fact, part of the problem arises from certainly from recent pieces of legislation. One, of course, paradoxically, is the 2010 Equality Act, which it's not about the fact that students may be interpolated as customers, but university administrators take that and are so risk adverse and run with that, so that they act as if this is an invitation to police free speech, academic freedom, or any other behavior that they deem to be offensive as microaggressions, which is why university lecturers are unlikely to be supported by their university administrations in cases of kind of dispute with students. Only very reluctantly did the Vice Chancellor of Sussex University eventually come to the defence of Kathleen Stock. The Higher Education Research Act in 2017 created this very powerful body called the Office for Students, which its mission is to promote competition, choice, and value for money. Now, this idea, though, of the student experience has become something of a kind of a mobilizing mantra with an aura of sacredness. And it's created a whole industry, a whole army of bureaucrats and administrators who claim to give the student voice, but it actually ends up homogenizing students and depriving them of agency and voice. So this is one of the, again, it's this whole, I think you made the point, Ava, earlier on, that's your kind of value for money is a narrative that is weaponized in support of management, and government does not empower students. Next slide, please. And if you want evidence of this, last week a report was published by King's College London, the Policy Institute, which actually showed that in a 12-year period from 2006 to 2018, managers and professional staff employed by UK universities grew by about 60%. And a large contingent of this was employees recruited to deal with the student experience, which more than doubled. And there's a quote from Baroness Wolff, who wrote this report. She says, "We were shocked time and time again when we did the interviews. People would say, if you want to justify a new post, what you do is say, this will improve the student experience." Also, what the report showed is that there's been a massive centralisation of UK universities and a corresponding decline in academic support staff. And, this is the key point, an 80% increase in academics on teaching-only casualised contracts. So here's evidence that all these things about the student experience and the managerialisation of universities is resulting directly in the casualisation of the workforce. Next slide, please. Oh, this is my conclusions. And yeah, so what I'm saying then is that, yeah, academic freedom is under assault. It's not a silent spring. It's a perfect storm. It's an assemblage or a matrix of threats. The Equality Act, the Student Experience, the 2017 Higher Education and Research Act, the reconfiguring of students as consumers. Even if they don't buy into or internalize that identity, it has consequences for the way that university managers act and interpret it. And the net result is a really chilling, stilling effect on academic freedom, because a lot of people, a lot of academics, a lot of my colleagues, myself included, no longer feel very safe to express unpopular views or on sensitive subjects or risk offence. And those subjects could be gender, they could be Israel-Palestine, they could be trans rights or whatever. But there, there's a certain dangerous ground now where you just it's better to stay silent. So my final question, who is actually empowered by these developments? Certainly not academics, certainly not students, and probably not democracy either. So who is the big beneficiary of this? I'll end there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chris. Fantastic presentation. And there's some themes running through these. You might say that there's a silent spring that's being turned into a perfect storm. But there's also the question about who is defining what for who. I'm going to now just try and quickly present some of the things that are happening in Denmark. And I've got two strands which I haven't been able to connect together in the way that Jakob has collected his strands and Chris has connected strands together as well. But I start off with the point that in Denmark, we do not have a concept of academic freedom. We only have a concept of research freedom. So when we did the interviews for the pandemic study, we asked leaders who owns and controls the data. I was aware of the discussion that we've been having in our seminars, in our webinars, and all the universities have been using Zoom and Teams during the pandemic, and none of them had thought about it. So the whole way that Eva presented our thinking about academic freedom is just wasn't visible in the conversations with university leaders in Denmark. The problems in Denmark are much more about how to defend what you might call traditional research freedom. And we've got two kinds of things happening. We've got a series of scandals where we've got the interference of external interests in academic research. And we've got a series of attacks from politicians in the media and parliament in a similar way to the way Jakob has talked about, but also this idea of who has the right to define what's going on in the way that also Chris has been raising. And as ever in Denmark, we go back to the university law in 2003, And the politicians at that time said that that law was setting universities free. And here we get the word freedom is used in a completely new way. So free universities were self-owning universities, which means they were entities in a world, a neoliberal world made up of lots of entities, all who are competing in pursuit of their own interests. And the university is set free as a competitive entity within that new environment. And by law, the universities had to be responsive to surrounding society. And the surrounding society is politicians, public authorities, industry, civil society, students, you name it. All are entitled to make demands on the university for its research and its teaching as a public service. We're open to demands from surrounding society. And university is to negotiate those demands and agree them in contracts. And one of the meanings of self-owning was that the legal status of the university changed so that it became a person that could enter into contracts in law. So in negotiating and agreeing contracts, the university then in law is to defend and uphold the scientific ethics and freedom of research of the individual researcher as well as the university as a whole. So nobody else is going to defend the academic freedom of the university or of the individual researcher. It's entirely up to the university to do that. And we've had a number of scandals. I've just listed a few here. I've listed 4 here, but the newspapers are just repetitively talking about scandals around academic research. The first one that I've listed here is called Gulligate, which translating means manure gate, or you could call it shitgate. And the government wanted to develop a new agricultural package which allowed farmers to use far more nitrogen and fertilizer to try and increase their crop yields. And then there was a question of how much runoff would then pollute the water. And Aarhus University was commissioned to provide the figures for that. And the minister then changed those figures and presented it to Parliament. And the researchers couldn't say anything because there was a double muzzle. In the contract that the university had entered into with the ministry, they were not allowed to comment on the figures, and they weren't even allowed to say that they had a contract with the ministry. So there was a complete muzzle on the university that the university had entered into itself. And if that wasn't enough, then one of the lobby organizations, Sustainable Agriculture, has followed that on with a defamation case against the main academic who has produced those statistics. He's just won that case against sustainable education, but 3 years of his life has been taken up with a law case. The second scandal is called the beef scandal, which also involves Aarhus University and the Technical University. They're an organisation called the Cattle Fund, which it gets its income from every cow that's killed, paid for and partly wrote a report that came out in the name of Aarhus University researchers, claiming that beef is more environmentally friendly than coffee, beer, or sweets. And that was disputed a little bit in public because it seemed a bit strange. And we found that the contract had given the Cattle Fund the right to alter the actual text, and yet their name didn't appear as an author. Just recently, there's been a row brewing for a number of years that's now hit the newspaper about a local authority that commissioned another university to do an evaluation of their care of vulnerable families. They didn't like the results, and they required the university to hand over all the research notes, and including the handwritten, the notes of the personal notes of the interviews with the vulnerable families. And the local authority has then given that to a consultancy firm to rewrite the results of the research into its own report. And the researchers obviously tried to resist, but the university had entered into a contract which gave the local authority the right to have all the data. And now we've got the fourth one, which is going, or just happened with the resignation of the professor involved, where there was a PhD, industrial PhD between Copenhagen University and another organization, Agriculture and Foods, to analyze the extent of dangerous pig parasites, which are extremely dangerous for human health. And Agriculture and Foods broke the contract that had been carefully entered into by the university over the data collection, and so that it improved the results. The professor said that she was not accepting that data, but the Copenhagen University supported Agricultural Foods, and she's had to resign. So here's a whole series of scandals around research activity, and I think the root cause of it is the contracts that the university is entering into with the surrounding society. Where's me thing there? But on the other hand, we've got another set of attacks on universities, which are more in line with what Jakob and Chris are talking about, and that is where politicians in particular are attacking the universities. And the Minister for Foreigners and Integration in 2020 refused to publish or put on the website, the ministry's website, a report that the ministry had paid for from a university on what they called the negative social control of minority cultures. Obviously, this is trying to look at Muslim minorities in Denmark and the idea that they control women and have negative social control over their own people. The results of the research didn't fit the policy, so the publicly funded research was removed, and that generated a lot of criticism, but not least by the public criticizing the researchers. RUC tried to defend itself, but the balance of power is very clearly very difficult. The next one was when a series of attacks in the newspapers and in Parliament, politicians have been attacking named individuals and named research groups in particular universities around all of the usual suspects: integration, post-colonial theory, queer theory, gender theory, intersectionality, critical race theory, you name it. They are all now called excessive, this is academics developing excessive activism through their research. Politics dressed up as science, pseudoscience. And in May 2021, these politicians made a declaration in Parliament, which was then, these are right-wing politicians, but was then supported by the Social Democrat minister, saying that they distrust universities and they distrust the ability of the leaders to protect academic freedom, which is, of course, the legal thing. It's the university that has to protect its own academic freedom. And their response is that academics should welcome criticism. People are taking notice of their research and should stand up and defend it. But the question is how? So leaders have tried in the press to make reasoned arguments, but they seem to take no notice. Academics signed a massive petition to the minister, trying to ask the minister to withdraw her support for the declaration, but there was no effect. And a PhD student who'd been attacked in Parliament wrote a riposte in the social media and in the Researchers magazine, which is probably the most effective riposte. But writing in a student magazine or a researchers magazine is not the same as standing up and being attacked in Parliament. So the balance of power here is absolutely unequal. So if the effects are that researchers are feeling inhibited from discussing their results in public, which is one of the cornerstones of Danish democracy. But on the other hand, the union has done a survey which shows that 1 in 8 researchers do feel that their research freedom is attacked. But the attack is not from the politicians saying that these unacceptable areas of research are because there's certain academics who are trying to shut up other academics who don't use post-colonial theory or queer theory or whatever. They say it's because the pressure is coming from the external authorities that are commissioning the research in the industry, in government, and from the funding bodies in these unequal contracts. So I just, conclude by saying, well, what do we do about this? Why is this happening? And when you look at actually what the structure is within the university for defending its own academic freedom, there aren't statutes in the universities to say this is what academic freedom is and this is how we defend it. There haven't been any written policies or procedures even. Just recently, a few are getting written. And the academic forums through which the kind of Mertonian dissensus and communism, as you called it, could be developed, they were all abolished in 2003. So we haven't got the equipment within the university to protect our own academic freedom. And we certainly are very much under attack, both from the way the universities are entering into the contracts with surrounding society, but also in a way that the right wing in particular, now supported by the Social Democrats, are attacking the ability of academics to manage their own academic freedom. Thank you. Okay, so that little skate through 4 countries has given you a kind of a head blast of some of the problems of academic freedom that we see as the state of academic freedom at the moment. Now we're going to give the difficult task to Astrid Söderberg Widding, who is the rector of Stockholm University and the vice president of the Magna Charta organization, which, as you probably know, was a very famously has written a Magna Charta and just recently revised that Magna Charta. So we've invited Astrid to perhaps be able to show us some positive ways forward. Over to Astrid.
Thank you. This is impossible, but thank you so much for inviting me to talk at this highly topical conference on European universities' critical futures. Universities are indeed, since the Middle Ages, keystones in European societies. And throughout the ages, they have sometimes enjoyed support from authorities, from society, and at other times rather been challenged, criticized, shut down, or worse, assimilated into regimes opposing fundamental academic values. But the issue of academic freedom is at heart in this varied history, though, of course, its meaning has shifted throughout the centuries. When celebrating the 900 years of Europe's alma mater studiorum, the University of Bologna, this was marked in a very special way. In 1988, 388, mostly European universities, went to Bologna to sign the Magna Carta Universitatum. The aims of this document were to celebrate the deepest values of university traditions and to encourage strong bonds among European universities. Academic freedom is indeed a fundamental value for all universities across the globe, and together with institutional autonomy, it constitutes the base for this original Magna Carta document, which states that the university is an autonomous institution at the heart of societies, that research and teaching must be morally and intellectually independent of all political authority and economic power. Teaching and research in universities must be inseparable if their tuition is not to lag behind changing needs, the demands of society, and advances in scientific knowledge. Also, that freedom in research and training is the fundamental principle of university life, and that governments and universities must ensure respect for this fundamental requirement. And finally, that a university is the trustee of the European humanist tradition. Its constant care is to attain universal knowledge. To fulfill its vocation, it transcends geographical and political frontiers and affirms the vital need for different cultures to know and influence each other. This, of course, may seem evident, but as we have heard from our examples today, it is not. So I think it deserves to be repeated again and again. In the first 30 years of the Magna Carta, no less than 900 universities from over 80 countries did sign it. But then to the critical futures, because these principles and values still being fully valid and relevant, the Magna Carta after 30 years realized that not only had the world changed, but also the needs and the expectations that the society had of universities. Thus, a multinational group was formed, led by the former president of the Magna Carta Observatory, Seibold Norda, to review the MCU in the context of the changes to universities and the environments in which they operate, which had occurred since 1988. This was informed by a very large consultation, and a new version, the MCO 2020, was adopted by the Governing Council of the MCO in 2020 and launched this year due to the pandemics, of course. This new MCU strives to be responsive to and resonate with contemporary challenges and concerns. It removes nothing from the original 1988 values, but it emphasizes the global nature of universities' endeavors, as well as their societal responsibilities. And this additional document is now being signed by a number of new universities across the globe. It has been extremely interesting to hear today the different examples of academic freedom or threats to academic freedom from different countries. And it is clear that what is at stake today has to do not only with fundamental academic values, but also societal values such as democracy and freedom of speech. My task is not to add yet another case, but I cannot resist just giving you a glimpse also from Sweden, where the parliament, following the last research bill from December 2020, has recently decided to include academic freedom, as opposed to research freedom only, in the Higher Education Act. However, there is a limit. In an addendum, it is specified that this academic freedom should be subordinated to the so-called public service ethos, common to all state authorities. This, in fact, meant that priorities other than academically motivated might be deemed as more important for universities from the government's point of view. And this, in turn, led to a huge debate in Sweden on the role of academic freedom specifically in relation to other societal values. So, with or without direct threats, the issue is indeed at stake across the whole of Europe, which is our focus today. But to return to the more general question, quo vadis as European universities in a global context towards our critical futures? One might rightly ask whether the increasing interest in universities from the European Commission, both with the upcoming European Strategy for Universities and the European University Initiative, is a positive sign of support for academic freedom, or rather a worrying sign of political intervention, which might have negative impact on the university's freedom and autonomy. On one hand, all official documents honor the fundamental academic values. On the other hand, it is clear that the societal challenges are enormous and that universities need to engage. Hence the new MCU document, which emphasizes our responsibilities as universities, but still claiming that these have to be formulated and addressed by ourselves within academia and not by demands from politicians or from the market, but of course in close dialogue with society. In this context, I would also like to mention the important document from the European University Association, which rightly claims to be the voice of Europe's universities. It is called Universities Without Walls, a vision for 2030. In the foreword, Michael Murphy and Amanda Crowfoot argue that universities today have the sense of being at, I quote, a tipping point, a time of transformation driven by multiple economic, political, and environmental pressures, end of quote, where the pandemic adds to the urgency of addressing what our societies should be or will be. But they also mention the developments at the European level, and I quote again, both with the emerging European education area and the revitalized European research area seeking to shape a common political direction. There is a need for a clear vision for and by universities, how they want to develop, shape, and respond to these challenges over this decade. End of quote. The document is directed to universities, but just as much it invites partners from other parts of society, as well as policymakers, to engage with us and join forces for a better future. And a final quote, key to success will be universities that are open, enforcing the vision of universities without walls, engaging deeply with other parts of society while firmly rooted in their values. End of quote. I would also really like to acknowledge today the breadth of scope underlying this conference, as well as your previous series of open webinars, not only addressing the governments dealing with academic freedom, but also the ongoing marketization of the sector, where Eva Hartman has rightly underlined that we still even lack adequate terminology. And also the aim to address how we might take academic freedom forward is extremely important, of course, in this both complex and challenging landscape. As I've been asked to intervene from the Magna Carta point of view, I would here like to say a few words about our Living Values initiative, which I see as a very powerful tool for us as universities to enhance our own awareness of academic freedom and other important core values. The idea with this project, which after a pilot period where I had the privilege to take part as rector of Stockholm University, has now become a kind of toolbox available for all on the Magna Carta Observatory website. It was to put these fundamental values into practice within our universities through thorough discussions with both professors, teachers, students across the whole of the university. The task was not only to engage in fundamental values such as academic freedom and autonomy, equity and integrity, and to discuss how they are or perhaps are not lived within our universities, but also to identify our own specific institutional values, values of importance to us as universities. Without a culture actually promoting academic freedom and other core values within our institutions, official declarations are indeed worthless. To implement these values, such as intellectual and moral autonomy, is a precondition for any university, but the values also have to be recognized by governments and by society at large. However, having done the homework, so to speak, we also become more powerful when engaging in debates outwards. The Living Values project has indeed convinced me of the great potential in actively addressing these core questions for any academic institution in order to face any challenge with lucidity, to be proactive in actually implementing the values, and to develop a common institutional culture to promote academic freedom for the benefit of not of the university as a whole, but also for us to be able to realize our greatest potential as universities, the possibility to freely pursue the quest for scientific truth. This said, here I am aware that I still remain on a very general level. It is easy to agree on overarching principles, and I very much like what Jakob was saying about de-universalizing academic freedom and to adopt a relational approach. But I think a good thing with this panel is that it has really sought to break down those principles to concrete challenges. First of all, in Eva speak, the commodifications of higher education, which I believe is a real threat to academic freedom. And I think we share this to different degrees in many of our European countries. Not only do we have to prove that our accomplishments are defendable in monetary and rate of return terms, but we also have to argue that they provide further knowledge of critical importance for societies of the future, beyond what is immediately important from a monetary perspective. And secondly, and equally important, the challenges in the publication sector, of which I'm painfully aware as chair of the Swedish BIBSAM consortium, responsible for all negotiations from the sector with publishing companies, and where I'm convinced that we need to rethink our ways of assessing scholarly merits and our ways of actually communicating our research, which is in itself presents us with huge challenges. At the moment, commercial publishers, as always, seem to be the winners. In their for-profit models, they easily adapt to the new open access model, but building in factors that will ensure their profit for the future. Open sharing within the scholarly community here seems to be the way to go, both here and when it comes to educational resources and open source software. Thirdly, of course, also the role of digitalization and the enormous challenges in the intersection with privatization. So in my view, what we have to do as universities today is to powerfully reclaim our role as autonomous and free academic institutions in service of the commons and the public good. We need to reclaim our interpretative prerogative within all the issues that have been addressed today. The universities, not politicians or market demands, should define their own role in and for society and shoulder its responsibilities in creating new communities beyond the academic one in close dialogue with society. We need to convince society, with all the challenges that we are facing today, with threats not only to academic freedom, but also to democracy and free speech, that our mission and vision go well beyond the more limited operational values. And we must address the challenging topic of academic freedom as such, which has to deal not only, as we heard, with threats from the outside, but also from within, such as growing illiberalism on the campus, though these, of course, remain closely interrelated. We need to argue again and again for all those issues related to today's complex topics. We need to strive for alternative conditions for knowledge creation and for alternative trust-building practices. We also need to address collectively, in dialogue, in a relational way, the problematics of our societies, of political, social, and geopolitical upheaval that we all as higher education institutions have to face. And I'm convinced that we, as universities, are prepared to face all these challenges together. And we need to do so across borders to realize our common vision of academic freedom for the future. Thank you.